This video is now in session, and if you looked at the polls or if you looked at the thumbnail, then you'll see that for many of the races that we saw as lean Democratic or Democratic trending in the polls, in reality, we think that it's a Republican lead-in state and vice versa. So it kind of invites, that thumbnail invites the discussion of how should we trust polls in the 2022 election, considering that in the 2020 election, the polls got it right, or wrong rather, but in the 2018 election, a midterm election, the polls did get it right. And that's something that we've had to grapple with the creation of our outlook, which is the first time we've done this kind of thing for an election, where we kind of look at how the races are going in terms of it being favored for the Democratic or the Republican Party. And what we kind of settled on with the answer is that it's kind of a cop-out answer, but it depends. And what we mean by it depends is that in some states, some polls are correct. In other states, all polls are correct. So going into that, let's take the U.S. Senate as an example, the one from our thumbnail. So you'll see that for a state like Nevada, even though the polls, the aggregate polls say that in Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto, the incumbent senator, is leading in that race, we actually think that right now it's favoring the Republican Party, favoring Adam Laxalt, just because of how polling goes for this state. So Nevada, if you remember in the 2020 election, Joe Biden won the state by 2.4 percentage points, which is a lot lower than a lot of polls expected it to be. So if you look at Emerson College, they did get it close with 2%. If you look at NYTimes, it was further off with 6%. And then if you look here at the Trafalgar group, they were actually more consistently accurate than any other pollster in the state of Nevada, by having Biden up by 2 points here and then having Trump up by 1 point in this in this final poll. So it basically shows that for a state like Nevada, where if you look at the composition, it's a lot of union workers who have trended more towards the Republican Party in recent years, and to Donald Trump in particular during 2016 and the 2020 election, then a lot of the polls get it wrong in Nevada, with the exception of maybe Emerson College and more poignantly or more relevantly the Trafalgar group, which is a conservative pollster. Now, if we look at the Rust Belt states, the same thing happens, the same kind of occurrence in the 2020 election. Many of these polls were incorrect by stating that Joe Biden, or by polling voters that had the aggregate total into a likely win by Joe Biden, when in reality it was a tilt margin. And you can see here that really the only consistently correct poll, or close to correct polling, is from the Trafalgar group, where they had an almost statistical tie between Joe Biden and Donald Trump at 47%. That's pretty close to what actually happened, which was 49.4% for Joe Biden and 48.8% for Donald Trump. Compare that to the NYTimes poll, where you have Biden up by 11%. Compare that to the Emerson College poll, where you have Biden up by 9%. And even by Marquette, which is a local pollster, had Biden up by 5%. And you'll see that ultimately the Trafalgar group does do better in these more blue-collar union states. So if we look at that trend, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Nevada, those kind of states, as well as Ohio and Iowa, those kinds of states fall under the prone to polling errors category. And in those states, we do value polls like the Trafalgar group more than the more reputable pollsters, simply because the Trafalgar group is doing something right there. But that doesn't mean we rely on them, or that you should rely on a single pollster for every single state just because they got the 2016 election correct compared to the other polls. If you look at more suburban states, in states like Georgia, the polls are actually pretty correct. If you look at the 2020 election, the Senate election, the aggregate polling was actually pretty close to what happened happened in the general election. So you can see here that that 538 forecasted Ossoff to lose by 0.3 percentage points in the general election, and if you look at the polling averages, that was largely true with what the poll said. Ossoff 1 point, Ossoff 2 points, the more reputable pollsters anyway. Ossoff 3 points, Purdue 1 point. Pretty close to what actually happened. Same thing with Raphael Warnock's race in the Georgia special election. And if you look at the runoff election, they were even more accurate than they were in the general election. In Arizona, the polling was a little bit off, but ultimately, Mark Kelly did win by around 3 to 4 percentage points, which is not that far from what a lot of these polls were saying. New York Times 7%, Emerson College 3%. So you see here that for states like Arizona and Georgia and Michigan, because Michigan does have a lot of suburban voters, the polls are actually not that far off. At least in the 2020 election and the 2018 and in some part in the 2016 election, compared to the more blue collar states like Nevada. It seems like there's a trend forming where a lot of blue collar workers are not as likely to respond to polls as suburban voters, and both groups are more like the more moderate kinds of voters that could swing elections. So that's something that we have to take into account of. It's not like we're saying that you can't trust the polls like other people are saying, because polls do provide some kind of snapshot into the state, and they're still like one of the easiest ways we can actually see what is happening in a state, other than like being in the state or being from the state. So yeah, you should take polls with a grain of salt, but the way we approach polls and the way that you should approach polls is to consider how polls have performed in previous elections and then choose the best pollsters for each state. And that's what we've been doing with our outlook, and that's why we have Ohio a likely Republican state instead of a lean Republican state or a lean Democratic state for the Senate race. Because even though the polls say that Tim Ryan is up, ultimately, if you look at the 2020 election, the same thing happened. The same trend happened with Joe Biden being up by around 2-3 percentage points, when in reality, Trump won that state by 8 percentage points. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.